We began our research in 1974. And the purpose at that point was pretty modest. We were simply trying to figure out, was it possible to behaviorally separate organizations that were successfully changing versus those that were not? Wasn't a very sophisticated research project. It's just now in its 31st year. It never stopped. Today, it's common knowledge that there are patterns, very predictable patterns associated with what happens when organizations successfully change and those that don't. In the early 70s, there was some suspicion about that, but there was no confirmation. Now, the definitions we were using in those days were also pretty unsophisticated. We looked for the difference between winners and losers. Winners were companies that were achieving the full value of what they said they wanted. Didn't matter what the nature of the change was. Could be IT related, could have been a merger, could be reorganization, new systems, didn't matter. As long as it was a major change. In a few minutes I'm going to give you a definition for what constitutes a major change. As long as it was a major change and they got what they wanted within the time and budget constraints that they had originally set out, we called them winners. Losers either never got what they were after or they spent a lot more time and money than they had anticipated. See, it's wonderful for your ego to have the magic dust nobody else understands, but you can't create institutional capability with magic dust. We've got to pull from what our gut has taught us to do, and we have to create structure and discipline. That's where we can get the consistency and the transferability to build institutional capability. It is such a strong motivator to stay in predictable environments that as a species, we will consistently choose things that don't work rather than unfamiliarity. It could be my washing machine or my marriage or my company. I know it's broken, but it's mine. I'm keeping it. That's how strong this need is. We don't like change. There is a horrendous track record for major change succeeding. I mean, it's embarrassing. And by the way, it runs across industries and it runs across countries. About 3 out of 10 times leaders get what it is they ask for when they engage a major significant change in the organization. Major change occurs when you significantly disrupt people's expectations. It has nothing to do with the content of what you're doing. Nothing. I've seen millions of dollars be used to bring in new technology, but it was so consistent with what people anticipated, it actually wasn't a big deal. I've seen paper clips move from one side of an office to another and it produced a cultural bloodbath. We get so invested in these icons, right? Those are mine. Don't move them. Don't pay attention to how much money you're spending. It is not a predictor of major change. Here's one that's interesting. Don't pay any attention to whether people like what you're doing. Here's the losing logic. Oh, be careful about this. People are going to be upset on this one. Okay, probably good advice, but what does the opposite tell us? Oh, don't worry about this one. We'll get a standing ovation on this. So the underlying assumption is if people like change, you don't have to worry about it. Wrong. Some of the strongest resistance you'll ever incur will take place when you give people exactly what they ask for. I was watching the Ted Koppel in 1988. I was watching one of his Nightline, and they were interviewing the survivor of one of the few survivors of the Piper Alpha rig that had blown up several miles offshore in the North Sea, I think 2 days earlier. They were in the hospital interviewing Andy. Andy was a shift foreman. The explosion occurred at 9:30 in the evening. Andy, because of the shift rotation, Andy had been asleep for a while. Now, the crew quarters is in the front right-hand quadrant. This is a huge, massive square of iron. It's large enough for 200 people to live permanently. This thing is massive. The front right-hand quadrant from this perspective is where the crew quarters were. Andy wasn't just thrown out of his bunk, he was thrown out of the whole crew area from the explosion. He was hurt very badly, but not incapacitated. He said he pulled himself out of his daze, figured out what was necessary, ran over to the platform, jumped into the water, and was rescued. Now, it's important that this was Ted Koppel's Nightline, because if it had been CNN News, that would have been it. I mean, it's all in 30 seconds. You got like a 20-minute segment talking to this guy. So here's what you find out. Andy jumped 150 feet into burning oil. If the fall didn't kill him, and the fire didn't kill him, and the water didn't kill him, he didn't know if there was a rescue vessel. There was, but it was out of line of sight. So So he was picked up pretty quickly, but he had no notion that it was there. All right, so the interviewer brings all this story together and says, how in the world did you bring yourself to make that decision? How did you jump? And he said two things that got my attention. If I stayed on the platform, I was going to fry. I chose probable death over inevitable death. That's commitment. You want commitment? You know, give a good speech, pop some videos, give out the T-shirts, you got the commitment. How does it keep going? Here's the formula. People have to believe that the price for the status quo is dramatically higher than the cost of the transition. My hope was that by sharing this with you, that it would give you some insight that there's an underlying structure, what appears to be rather sometimes chaotic and arbitrary in terms of whether change succeeds or not. There's actually a structure. If you choose to tap into it and use it as a leader, you can architect change. Do you always get what you want? No. You can dramatically increase the likelihood that you can end up delivering on the promises. That's not always important, but for those projects that you and the shareholders and the board and your boss have decided are really important, then that's where our professional responsibility really comes.